So our final presentation this morning comes from a man who provides essential reading twice a week in the pages of the Irish Times. I suspect perhaps some of you in the room might not always agree with him, but I'm sure you'll always be stimulated by the arguments that he puts forward. And he has been particularly strong in relation to Brexit over the last year. But we've asked him to look a little bit forward to the challenge of the 2020s. Would you please welcome Fintan O'Toole?
Good morning, everybody. Matt initially mentioned that there were 3 interesting speakers, and you've had them, so he was very accurate in his predictions that way. The greatest political novel probably is Giuseppe de Lampedusa's The Leopard, which is set in the revolutionary period in Italy, the Risorgimento with Mazzini and Garibaldi and all of that going on. And there's a wonderful moment in it where the prince, who is obviously conservative, attached to the old regime, is horrified to discover that his nephew, his beloved nephew, Tancredi, is running off to join the rebels. And he berates him, says, you know, you're part of the old regime, how can you be doing this? And Tancredi says, in order for things to stay the same, things must change. And that's the paradox, really, that we are experiencing and living in right now in the aftermath of an extraordinary election that we've just had. But also, it's the management of that paradox, I think, that's going to define how well Ireland looks in 2030. How can we respond to the idea that things that we value, that we like, that are at the core of the very positive aspects of our society, how can they stay the same in an era when change and radical change may be inevitable? I think if we think about this, there are obviously 2 fundamental issues that we have to face. The previous speakers have spoken brilliantly about them, and I'm not going to repeat what they've said. So let's take those things largely as read. But the 2 fundamental things, obviously, are how, I think, as Danny has put it, how can we match in public services and in the way in which public services embody decent civilized values, how can we match those to a growing, successful private sector and economy? And the second issue, of course, is what effect are the big seismic shifts in questions of identity and belonging on these islands, which are manifested in different ways in Brexit, but also in Scottish nationalism and in the questions of United Ireland. How are they going to play out? Conservatism in relation to both of these questions is not an option. So one of the things that we're seeing, and it's very much, I think, implicit in the election, is that the Irish public has decided something really quite fundamental. And what it's decided is in relation to risk. We're coming up to the centenary of the foundation of the state. Assuming any kind of stable government is formed, it will be the government in place after 100 years. W.B. Yeats said in that revolutionary period, Ireland is like molten wax. It will take shape in the next few years, and it will hold that shape for 100 years. It's pretty right, actually. Poets tend to be pretty good about this stuff. The molten wax took the shape of a partitioned island, of 2 sectarian states, and that wax has been melting, and I think we're seeing an acceleration in that meltdown right now. But in particular, we're seeing changes in the way people are thinking about risk. The Irish state, the Southern Irish state as it was formed, has been one of the most risk-averse political cultures in the democratic world. It constructed a system in which change meant an alteration effectively between 2 identical conservative centre-right parties. And that tells us something about maybe the kind of culture we have. We like to think about ourselves as the wild, imaginative, out there Irish. Actually, we're very, very risk averse. Somebody once said that if the Irish were in the Garden of Eden, we would have licked the apple. And politically, that's what we've done, right? So if you look at it overall, we've been very good at not taking big risks. Change has meant change within a very, very narrow range of options. What's happened now is that there's a collective understanding that actually being risk-averse is now very risky. Why is it risky? It's risky because of climate change. If you don't change radically, extinction is on the horizon. It's risky because a lot of people's actual lives, particularly younger people's lives, have become much, much more unstable, much more insecure. They're living lives where the very things that stabilized life for so many of us don't stabilize life anymore. I'm getting up to 62. I'm of a generation where there were 3 things you expected to get if you were aspirant. I'm a product of all that change in Ireland. I'm coming from working class communities where people never went to secondary school, never mind to university, and coming through all of that. What did you aspire to? You aspired to 3 things. You aspired to have, to get married, as we would have said, but, to have a stable partnership, to get a good job, which you might hope to stay in for the rest of your life, and to settle down in a house. Those were the 3 things you thought about. Now, actually, those aspirations, funny enough, have broadly speaking not changed. Yes, people understand that these things are more fluid, but they still want them. The problem is that the Irish society is at a real juncture whereby it's not able to provide those stabilizers for a whole generation of people. The people who can't put those 3 things together. So you might well have what by the standards of your parents was a fantastic job. You might well have a great relationship and see that as your future, but the housing bit of it, the bit of settling down, of actually rooting yourself in the society has become much, much more difficult. So what people have been telling us in the election is, I don't feel that my life is now so secure that I can't take a big risk. The Irish public has just taken an enormous risk, and what it's done is it's killed off the lick the apple system, right? It's killed that off. It said, we are no longer in a political culture whereby we're going to move between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. 43% is now Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael put together. It was unimaginable 10 years ago that you would get to a point whereby, in some kind of left-wing fantasy, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were forced together, that they wouldn't have a massive majority. In fact, and you do begin to feel very old in Ireland, one of the great arguments, I was always arguing Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael should merge, and one of the great arguments, those very powerful arguments that people would put up, was saying, but if they merge, they would be so dominant, it would be very bad for democracy. They would have 80% of the seats in the Dáil. Well, look at it now. We're literally at a position whereby, if they merge, they could not actually form a government. So the public have done that. They've decided to kill off that system and kill it off definitively, and they've decided to accept risk. But what we have to remember, and this goes back to Francesca's thing about, is it change or revolution? Why are they doing this? They're creating an enormous change in order to try to create more stability in their own lives. What they want to do is get rid of anxiety. They want to get rid of anxiety about, where am I going to live? What happens if I need healthcare? And the anxiety about environmental change. Those are 3 huge things that are bearing on people. And actually, in a way, what they're looking for is, how do I create stability? And they're deciding, in a way that they've never decided before, that in order to create stability, we have to have a very radical shake-up in the political system. And then the second aspect of this, of course, is how is this going to play in to those big questions of a united Ireland, which are obviously going to come even more to the fore. Whether or not Sinn Féin ends up in government, we can see that this has been happening, that we're moving towards it. Now, one of the things we've got to remember here, and I think this is where, in many ways, the traditional Sinn Féin narrative, which is a united Ireland is going to be created by the Irish people. This is our big moment. This is our change horizon as we're moving towards it. That narrative actually, ironically, given Sinn Féin's success, is one that has only in the last few years become entirely delusional. This is not our movie. So a united Ireland, whether you thought it was a good idea or a terrible idea, whether you were a unionist or a nationalist, was going to be a movie directed, produced, scripted, and acted by Irish people. What's happened, and it's a very profound change, is that this thing is coming towards us from the East. It's being driven not by Irish nationalism, but by English nationalism. And we don't fully yet know what the full consequences of the emergence of an English nationalism, which has expressed itself in Brexit, but will not be burned out by Brexit, because Brexit does not address the questions of belonging and identity that were at the heart of the Brexit referendum. This is a force which is going to be there, and we know that it's a force for radical change in the entire political architecture of the two islands. How do we know this? Well, 66% of members of the Conservative and the Unionist Party say, if the price for Brexit is a united Ireland, fine. 75% of Leave voters in England say, if Northern Ireland leaves the UK and joins the United Ireland, absolutely fine with them. They say the same about Scotland, by the way. So this is a force which is breaking the union from the other side. And we're going to be left with the consequences of it. And those consequences could come quite quickly. So therefore, the question is now no longer about, wouldn't thinking about a united Ireland be destabilizing? Wouldn't it be looking for a radical change that we might not be ready for? Well, yes, it might be. But an even more destabilizing force is not talking about it, not dealing with it, not looking to where is this huge change coming. If we want to manage this change, then we have to start a process of management. We can't keep saying, well, yes, it's something for the future. Something is underway. Its full consequences are absolutely unclear to us. But if we don't begin to engage with this right now, we may end up with it happening anyway, and happening in a chaotic way. So these two things, I'm out of time, but these two forces, I think, how do you match the growing economy with social provision? And what do we do about this huge change in the architecture of belonging on the two islands? Both require a certain kind of radicalism. Sitting on our hands and saying, you know what, we really should be risk averse, just simply isn't going to work anymore. It doesn't map onto the way our democracy is going, but it also doesn't map onto the underlying forces that are creating that appetite for democratic change. And the final thing then is that this cannot be managed by government alone. It can't be managed by political parties alone. This is a very broad social challenge. And I'm really encouraged, I think, to see the way in which Irish business is thinking about itself as part of Irish society, is thinking about itself as a player in the unfolding of all of this kind of social change. Because it has to be absolutely at the heart of this revolution, perhaps, but a revolution that could in fact lead us to be looking back from 2030 and say that we were faced with really very profound challenges, but we managed them collectively extremely well. Thank you very much.